Ever since the arrival of Takashi Kiryu as the president and representative director of Square Enix, there has been a pretty strong cultural shift with regards to how the company has been treating their digital-only products. This has seen numerous properties delisted for a variety of different reasons, and the new stance has compounded the company's previous reputation for shutting down mobile games within a very short period of time should they not perform well enough. When you then add in the platform holders like Nintendo and Sony enacting their own policies that either removed the ability to purchase games on certain platforms or made them very restrictive, it means there are now quite a few Final Fantasy games that can no longer be purchased or played unless you already had them downloaded on your device or you found a way to play them offline. Now, over 2 years ago, we published a list that contained 7 games of this nature, but even though it's only been a short space of time, another 7 games now fit the criteria, and some of them are pretty big. But before delving in, we have a small update. Our Kickstarter campaign for the Guardians of the Crystal has just finished, and the response overall was incredible. But that's not the end. Kickstarter has now enabled late pledges for those who missed out. If you'd like to support the channel and get an incredible reference book about every single summonable being from the mainline entries that also features a foreword from Ben Starr, the voice of Clive Rossfield, then please visit the link in the description below. But now, let's talk about some Final Fantasy games that you can't play anymore, unless, of course, you're incredibly diligent. In the early 2010s, the developers at Square Enix were still attempting to figure out how to best navigate the emerging mobile market. They had produced quite a few games that resonated with Japanese audiences, but they had struggled to replicate that success outside of Japan. That was until they stumbled on a new formula. The idea ended up being to produce the game first in Japan, then release a global version 6 to 12 months later. This global version would feature near identical content, but localization and kinks could be worked out ahead of time, making the entire process much more manageable. Record Keeper, Mobius, and Bravest Xius were the first 3 games to truly benefit from the approach, but of the 3, Bravest Xius ended up being by far the most successful. And it was so successful that it ended up spawning its own spin-off, which was called War of the Visions. Now, to ensure the 2 games did not cannibalize each other, the idea was to fuse elements from Bravest Xius with a new thematic setting. This saw everything much more focused on tactical role-playing, with Final Fantasy Tactics serving as a huge source of inspiration. But that wasn't all. As Square Enix partnered with Gumi on the project, they too drew inspiration from their own existing roster of successful properties. And it meant that War of the Visions was a fusion of Bravest Xius Tactics and games such as The Alchemist Code. Due to the success of Bravest Xius and the name-dropping of those other IPs, there was a huge amount of intrigue and attention surrounding War of the Visions, and it ended up being downloaded over 3 million times within 10 days of its Japanese launch. 3 months later, that figure was up to 9 million, and the number of downloads only continued to grow following the game's global launch, which happened only 5 months later, much quicker than any of the previous mobile games released outside of Japan. Since its launch, War of the Visions has gone on to generate hundreds of millions of dollars in Japan, but its global performance, despite everything that had come before, was nowhere near as strong. There were plenty of downloads, but War of the Visions suffered from its very aggressive monetization strategies that just didn't resonate with foreign audiences, and only around 25% of its lifetime revenue has come from the global version. With its returns continuing to diminish, it therefore no longer became financially viable for Square Enix to maintain the global version. So on the 25th of March 2025, this led to the announcement that the global version of War of the Visions was to be terminated on the 29th of May. There's no word yet about the Japanese version suffering a similar fate, although it too is starting to see diminishing returns, so a termination notice may be coming in the near future. Final Fantasy Explorers has an odd reputation amongst the fanbase, with many lamenting what the game could have been. The franchise has blended with plenty of adjacent genres before, with Final Fantasy Tactics and Final Fantasy XI standing as perhaps the 2 best examples. But as the franchise entered into the Square Enix era, despite there still being plenty of attempts to branch out, they didn't have anywhere near the same level of success. and Explorers unfortunately serves as a case study for this. Monster Hunter had been nothing short of a sensation throughout the early 2000s, especially on handheld devices, and this led to the creation of numerous other games that attempted to piggyback off the formula, such as God Eater, Tukiden, and Soul Sacrifice. Square Enix were also keen to explore how they could get in on the act, and this was pushed forward once Atsushi Hashimoto came up with a compelling concept for what became Explorers. Given the high-profile nature of the franchise and how much potential there was, when Explorers was announced it led to a lot of excitement. But the final product just didn't end up delivering, and its performance was both critically and commercially underwhelming. Even still, there were those who enjoyed Explorers, as it was a much calmer take on the genre, with a less steep learning curve. And it was still possible to dive into the game even after the physical version went out of print, as it could be purchased from the 3DS eShop. That was until Nintendo closed down the eShop towards the start of 2023. It means that now the only way to play Explorers is to get your hands on a physical copy or play a previously downloaded version. Fortunately, there are still a few copies that go live every month on eBay, and they're often at a pretty reasonable price. The original Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles is beloved by many due to its innovative take on cooperative gameplay. If you had a copy of the game, a GameCube, and a Game Boy Advance, and 3 friends who also each had their own Game Boy Advances, then you could embark on an adventure that required a lot of teamwork and coordination, with a little bit of selfishness thrown in for good measure. The experience wasn't quite the same for solo players, as the same teamwork and banter wasn't required to progress with the game, and this then struggled to mask the slow, methodical gameplay. But those who were able to enjoy the co-op aspect were overjoyed when Square Enix announced they were remastering the original game. And everything looked great on paper, but when the game released, the original ideologies had been warped. And one of the main reasons was the emphasis on being able to play Crystal Chronicles on a multitude of different devices, including smartphones. Needless to say, fans of the original were less than impressed with how the game had been modernised, as some of the decisions made everything feel like a complete chore, and the response then led to lackluster sales. When issues were then encountered with the iOS version of the game towards the start of 2025, instead of investing the time and money to fix them, Square Enix just chose to pull the plug. This saw support officially ended for the iOS version of Crystal Chronicles Remastered, and it was simply removed from the App Store. On the plus side, the game is still available on PlayStation 4, Switch and Android devices, but who knows how long that will remain the case. After working with their ongoing policies around polymorphic content, alongside a revitalized iteration of the Dissidia franchise, which was first released in arcades before being ported to the PlayStation 4, Square Enix also collaborated with Team Ninja on a smartphone gacha game set in the same universe called Opera Omnia. However, unlike every previous Dissidia game, Opera Omnia was transitioned to being a turn-based RPG. It also, contrary to the other gacha games being produced by Square Enix around the same time, offered very lax monetization strategies. This meant there was no penalization for simply wanting to play the game, and story progress was nowhere near as financially dependent. It did not feel like a pay-to-win. The other aspect was the game itself. For years, fans had been calling for some of the less popular, but still very popular characters to appear in Dissidia. The developers were unsure about taking this approach within the main games, but Opera Omnia gave them the opportunity to explore without the same kind of pressure. And the results were magical. Each character got to share their unique personalities, and the interactions felt natural with just the right amount of playfulness. Over time, Opera Omnia did start to delve a bit more into monetization, especially as power creep ventured into the game. But it still had a very long run before its eventual shutdown of both the Japanese and global versions towards the start of 2024. In an official statement from Jin Fujiwara, the game's producer, they noted that the decision had been taken due to a combination of operational and developmental considerations. This meant there had been a decline in performance, but they had made the decision to simply shut down the game instead of attempting to further make adjustments to compensate and exploit their audience. This was a very respectful choice, and it allowed Opera Omnia to go out with its head held high at a very natural point. Final Fantasy XV ended up being an all-encompassing affair, with an entire universe created to support the game itself, and whether the universe ended up being a good thing or a bad thing is up for debate, but it did enable Final Fantasy XV to become one of the best-selling Final Fantasy games ever made. There is a slight notion of reputational damage though that does need to be factored in, and that was most apparent when inserting Final Fantasy XV: A New Empire into the conversation. To help bolster revenue, Square Enix entered into a strategic partnership with a company called Machine Zone, which had been making a ridiculous amount of money through games such as Game of War and Mobile Strike. The former became notorious for using Kate Upton as part of its promotion, with the latter using Arnold Schwarzenegger. And both games ended up generating over $4 billion combined. Final Fantasy XV: A New Empire was to be the next major property for Machine Zone, serving as a fully licensed game. And despite lots of vitriol amongst the community, it succeeded, at least from a financial perspective. By 2019, it had generated an estimated $518 million, the revenue equivalent of selling 8.6 million full-priced games at a $60 price tag. In other words, A New Empire is likely to have generated more revenue than Final Fantasy XV itself. Due to how much of a cash cow it was for the company, they kept the game running for a very long time, but its service was ultimately terminated at the end of 2024, and it's no longer accessible, with even the website being shut down. Another much maligned game was Final Fantasy All the Bravest. But despite its horrible reputation, it outlasted most of Square Enix's other mobile properties and was only delisted after more than a decade on sale. The whole premise around All the Bravest was to create a game that could be easily monetized while also providing a source of entertainment for players. There was just one problem. Even though the game did provide some entertainment, it was quickly wiped away by how aggressive the monetization strategy ended up being. 2 points of contention related to characters and usage. On the first point, the more popular characters were locked behind a paywall. But should the decision be taken to purchase, then it was also not possible to select which character they wanted. It was decided by the game at random. On the second point, should the party wipe, they were given the choice to either wait 3 minutes per character to try again, or pay money to have them resurrected immediately. Both of these were deemed to be unacceptable, and the vitriol against the game was loud and aggressive. In spite of this, however, All the Bravest persisted as a purchasable app for Android devices until the end of 2022 and iOS devices until mid-2023. That then brings us on to another video game fatality that has a direct relationship to the first game we talked about, and that game is Brave Exvius. When it launched back in 2015, Brave Exvius presented a bold proposition. Whereas Record Keeper focused on old school nostalgia and Mobius focused on new school nostalgia, Brave Exvius was more of an original proposition. It featured a lavish story while conceptually merging Final Fantasy with the wildly successful Brave Frontier. And its combination of various elements proved to be a huge success, not just in Japan, but on a global scale. Download figures continued to rise and rise from launch. In July 2016, the game had been downloaded 11.5 million times, which rose to 20 million by February of the following year. And to push it further, Square partnered with the likes of Ariana Grande and Katy Perry, and they even launched purposeful fan festas around the world. Around this time, according to analysis by AppMagic and Pocket Gamer, Brave Exvius was said to be generating around $200 million per year for Square Enix. But by 2019, the game started to suffer from fatigue, and the development team were unable to correct a slide. During 2024, it was announced that the global version of Brave Exvius was to be terminated by the end of the year. By this point, the game as a collective entity had generated an estimated $896 million across its lifetime. This made it one of the most lucrative games ever released in association with the franchise, and probably only surpassed by Final Fantasy XI and XIV. As of right now, the Japanese version is still live, and this has seen it likely pass the $900 million mark as a result, but its performance has continued to decline even in that region, and it feels like the Japanese version of Brave Exvius could also be facing termination pretty soon. With that though, they were 7 Final Fantasy games that were delisted, meaning you can no longer play them. In some cases at all, and in other cases unless you play the Japanese version or own a certain system. Please though, share your comments below which of these you've played and enjoyed over the years. And if you enjoyed this video, feel free to hit that like button and subscribe for more content. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. As always, I'd like to give a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, Chris M. Walker, Christopher Gardner, Clever Chavez, EXP Required on YouTube, Gregory, Nate Hancock, Stephen and Sukan TDK, who are super special Onion Eye supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.